The house is gone. The company is finished. And by morning, every account with my name on it will be frozen. Ethan Cole placed the unsigned bankruptcy papers on the marble kitchen counter and watched his wife's face. Outside the glass walls of their Manhattan penthouse, rain blurred the city into streaks of silver and black. The chandelier above them still glowed warmly. The wine in the crystal glasses was still expensive. Everything around them whispered wealth. But Ethan had already arranged for it all to disappear. Or at least, to appear that way. For 12 years, Ethan had built Cole Meridian from a cramped office into a billion-dollar investment firm. People called him brilliant, ruthless, untouchable. He could silence a boardroom with one look and move markets with a single phone call. But that night, the billionaire CEO was terrified of one thing money could not answer. Did his wife love him, or the life he had given her? Across the counter stood Claire, still wearing the plain navy uniform from the community shelter where she volunteered 3 evenings a week. Before marrying Ethan, she had cleaned hotel rooms, raised her younger brother alone, and counted coins at grocery checkouts. Ethan's wealthy friends never let her forget it. They called her lucky. They said she had married well. They smiled at her across charity tables as though she were a guest who had wandered into the wrong ballroom. For months, Ethan had listened to their warnings. She'll leave when the money does. You never really know someone until the comfort disappears. So he had created the perfect test. His lawyer had prepared false documents. His closest business partner had agreed to call at midnight and confirm that the company had collapsed. The penthouse would be seized in the morning. Their credit cards would stop working. Even Ethan's driver had been told not to answer. He expected shock. Maybe anger. Maybe the quiet calculation of a woman deciding how quickly she could escape. Instead, Claire looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes moved from the papers to his pale face, then to his hands, which trembled despite his effort to keep them still. "How much time do we have?" she asked. "Until 8 tomorrow morning." "And there's nothing left?" Ethan forced himself to look away. "Nothing." Claire slowly removed her wedding ring. The soft click as it touched the marble seemed louder than the rain. Ethan's chest tightened. There it was. The answer he had been afraid of. She was already taking off the symbol of their marriage. Claire walked past him without another word and disappeared into their bedroom. A minute later, Ethan heard drawers opening, closet doors sliding, and the heavy thud of a suitcase hitting the floor. He stood alone beneath the chandelier, staring at the ring. He had wanted the truth. Now that it was coming, he could barely breathe. 20 minutes later, Claire returned wearing an old brown coat Ethan had not seen in years. One sleeve had been carefully stitched near the wrist. On her shoulder was a faded canvas backpack from the life she had lived before him. She placed the suitcase beside the door. Ethan swallowed. "So that's it?" Claire looked at him, confused. Then she reached into the backpack and pulled out a thick envelope, a small notebook, and a key attached to a worn red string. "No," she said quietly. "That's everything I saved before I met you." She pushed the envelope toward him. Inside were bank statements, folded bills, and years of untouched savings. Ethan stared at the amount. It was nowhere near enough to save a billion-dollar company. But it was everything she had. Claire picked up her wedding ring and slid it back onto her finger. "Put on something warm," she said. "We have one night to save your employees." By 11:30, the penthouse no longer looked like a home. Claire had opened every cabinet, emptied every drawer, and placed anything valuable on the dining table beneath the cold white light. Watches. Jewelry. Designer bags she had rarely used. Silver serving pieces Ethan had forgotten they owned. Ethan stood near the windows, watching her work with a focus that unsettled him. Most people froze when wealth disappeared. Claire became calm. She photographed each item, called a late-night auction contact from the shelter, and wrote numbers into the small notebook she had carried in the faded backpack. "You planned for this?" Ethan asked. Claire did not look up. "I planned to never be helpless again." The answer stayed between them. Years before she met Ethan, Claire Morgan had been invisible to people like him. At 16, she had left school to care for her younger brother, Noah, after their mother died. Their father had disappeared long before that, leaving behind unpaid rent, a broken refrigerator, and a photograph turned face down in a drawer. Claire cleaned rooms at the Beaumont Hotel during the day and worked in a 24-hour diner at night. She slept in bus stations when rent money ran short. She learned which grocery stores discounted bread after midnight and how to make one winter coat last through 6 freezing seasons. The brown coat she wore now had belonged to her mother. Inside its lining was a hand-stitched pocket no one could see. Claire reached into it and removed a small brass key. Ethan recognized it as the one tied to the faded red string. "What does that open?" "A storage locker in Queens." "What's inside?" Claire paused. "The part of my life I never wanted to sell." She placed the key inside the notebook and closed it. Ethan knew almost nothing about that locker. Claire had mentioned it once after their wedding, then changed the subject. He had assumed it held childhood clothes or old furniture. Now, for the first time, he noticed the notebook's damaged cover. A child had drawn a crooked blue house across the front. Beneath it, in faded pencil, were the words, "Claire keeps promises." She caught him staring. "Noah made it when he was 8, she said. The night we were evicted." Ethan lowered his eyes. He had spent years believing hardship made people bitter. In Claire, it had created a strange kind of discipline. At midnight, Ethan's phone rang. His business partner, Daniel, delivered the rehearsed lines with convincing panic. The banks had rejected every appeal. The board had turned against him. More than 400 employees would receive termination notices by morning. Claire listened from across the room. When the call ended, she asked only one question. "How much do they need to survive the month?" Ethan almost laughed from the cruelty of it. "Nearly $3 million. Claire looked down at the jewelry spread across the table. It would not come close. Neither would her savings. Yet she zipped the old backpack, lifted the suitcase, and walked toward the elevator. "Where are you going?" "To Queens." "For what?" She turned back, one hand resting over the hidden pocket inside her mother's coat. "For a promise I made before you ever knew my name." As the elevator doors closed, Ethan saw something in her face he had never seen in any boardroom. Not fear. Decision. The storage facility stood beneath an elevated train line in Queens, where rusted steel columns shook every few minutes and rainwater gathered in the cracks of the pavement. Claire arrived just after 1 in the morning. Ethan had followed her in a taxi. He told himself it was because the neighborhood was unsafe, but the truth was harder to admit. He still did not trust her. Some part of him believed the locker might contain an escape fund, a hidden passport, or proof that she had always prepared for the day his fortune disappeared. Claire noticed him as soon as he stepped from the cab. "You followed me. I wanted to make sure you were safe." "No," she said softly. "You wanted to see what I chose." Ethan had no answer. Inside, fluorescent lights flickered above narrow concrete corridors. Claire's old shoes squeaked against the wet floor. At locker 317, she removed the brass key from the hidden pocket in her mother's coat. Before she could unlock it, a black sedan pulled into the parking lot. Daniel stepped out with Ethan's attorney and 2 security men. Ethan's stomach dropped. This had not been part of the plan. Daniel hurried toward them, holding a folder beneath his coat. "We need to stop this," he whispered to Ethan. "The test has gone far enough." Claire heard him. Her hand froze on the lock. For one terrible second, Ethan thought everything had been exposed. But Daniel quickly changed course. He opened the folder and faced Claire with the cold expression he used during hostile negotiations. "Mrs. Cole, company investigators believe your husband may have transferred assets before the collapse." Ethan stared at him. Daniel was improvising. Claire remained still. Daniel continued, "Anything stored here could be seized. If you remove property tonight, it may look like fraud." One of the security men stepped closer. "Open the locker," he said. Claire looked at Ethan. He could have ended it then. He could have confessed that the accounts were safe, the company was thriving, and every document in the penthouse had been manufactured to test her loyalty. Instead, he stayed silent. He needed to know. The attorney glanced at Claire's worn coat and faded backpack with open contempt. "People from your background often keep emergency cash hidden," he said. "No offense." Claire's face did not change. But Ethan saw her fingers tighten around the brass key. "You think I stole from my husband?" she asked. "I think desperate people make desperate choices." The elevated train thundered above them, shaking dust from the ceiling. Claire lowered her eyes to the notebook in her hand. The crooked blue house Noah had drawn years ago was barely visible beneath the scratches. Then she unlocked the door. The metal shutter rolled upward with a harsh rattle. Inside were no suitcases of money. No secret jewelry. No passports. There were dozens of sealed cardboard boxes, an old sewing machine, stacks of handwritten letters, and a wooden chest marked with the logo of the Beaumont Hotel. Daniel frowned. "What is all this?" Claire walked past him and knelt beside the chest. "Things people left behind." The attorney gave a humorless laugh. "You brought us here for lost property?" Claire ignored him. She opened the chest and began removing envelopes, each labeled with a name, a date, and an amount. Ethan stepped closer. Some contained receipts. Others held signed notes and photographs of hotel employees standing beside Claire in faded uniforms. At the bottom lay an old leather ledger. Claire opened it to a page covered in hundreds of names. Ethan recognized several immediately. A state senator. A famous investor. The chairman of a major bank. Men who would never return his calls tonight if they believed he was ruined. "What are these names?" Ethan asked. Claire looked up at him. "People who once needed someone no one noticed." She pulled out her phone and placed the first call. A sleepy voice answered. Claire spoke only one sentence. "Mr. Bennett, I'm finally asking you to keep your promise." For 3 seconds, there was only static on the line. Then the sleepy voice became fully awake. "Claire Morgan?" "Yes." "You said you would never call unless it was serious." Claire looked at Ethan. "It's serious." She ended the call less than a minute later. No explanation. No pleading. No mention of Ethan's fortune, his company, or the hundreds of employees supposedly facing unemployment. She simply opened the leather ledger and dialed the next name. Then another. And another. The narrow corridor outside locker 317 became strangely still. Daniel stopped whispering to the attorney. The security men lowered their arms. Even the fluorescent light seemed to hum more softly as Claire's quiet voice traveled through the cold building. At first, Ethan thought it was hopeless. The people in that ledger were powerful, but power rarely moved without profit. He had spent his entire career learning that loyalty had limits, especially after midnight. Yet Claire never asked for charity. She reminded each person of a promise. At 2:15, the first car arrived. An elderly man in a rain-soaked suit stepped into the facility carrying a bank folder. Ethan recognized Walter Bennett, chairman of one of the largest private banks in the country. Bennett ignored Ethan completely. He walked straight to Claire. "How many families?" he asked. 412. Bennett nodded. "I'll cover payroll for 1 week." Ethan stared at him. Before he could speak, another vehicle pulled in. Then another. A hospital director arrived with her daughter. A restaurant owner came wearing an apron beneath his coat. A retired judge appeared with an umbrella broken by the wind. Some carried checks. Others made calls. One woman transferred money from her phone while standing beside the old sewing machine. By 3:30, the storage corridor looked like an emergency boardroom built from cardboard boxes and folding chairs. Daniel kept a running total on his tablet. 1.4 million, he whispered. The attorney looked shaken. Claire continued calling. Her voice grew tired, but never desperate. At 4:10, a young tech founder arrived and placed his phone on the wooden chest. I can't give cash tonight, he said. But I can guarantee the rest. Daniel looked up sharply. The rest? The man nodded. If the employees are real, I'll underwrite the full month. The corridor fell silent. Daniel refreshed the figures twice. Then he turned the screen toward Ethan. $3 million. Secured before dawn. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. His own board members had needed contracts, collateral, and weeks of negotiation before risking a fraction of that amount. Claire had walked into a freezing storage unit with an old coat, a damaged notebook, and a list of names and moved millions without promising anyone profit. Not one person had asked what they would receive in return. They had only asked Claire what she needed. She closed the ledger at last. Her hands were trembling now. Ethan stepped toward her, but she moved away. Why would they do this for you? He asked. Claire's eyes met his. Because once, when they had nothing, I believed them. At that moment, Daniel's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, then at Ethan. It's the board, he said carefully. They want to know how Claire saved the company before you did. Ethan looked around at the people filling the corridor, bankers, judges, owners, executives, all standing beside the woman his world had treated like she was lucky merely to enter it. For the first time in his life, Ethan Cole understood what real wealth looked like. And it did not belong to him. Ethan did not speak as the rain softened outside. The people who had filled the storage corridor began telling their stories one by one, not to impress him, but because Claire had never told them herself. Walter Bennett, the bank chairman, rested one hand on the old wooden chest. 20 years ago, I wasn't a chairman, he said. I was a man sleeping in a hotel stairwell. Ethan looked at him in disbelief. Bennett gave a faint smile. He had once lost everything after a failed business and a divorce. Too ashamed to call his family, he wandered into the Beaumont Hotel during a snowstorm and hid near the service entrance. Claire had found him there while collecting dirty towels. She had been 19. She had no money to spare, but she gave him half her dinner, let him wash his face in the staff restroom, and found him an old coat from Lost and Found. Before he left, she wrote his name inside the damaged notebook. Not because he owed her money. Because she made him write a promise. When life became kind to him again, he had to be kind to someone else. The hospital director stepped forward next. My daughter needed surgery, she said. Insurance refused to cover it. I was working nights at the hotel laundry. Claire had quietly organized a collection among housekeepers, cooks, bellmen, and dishwashers. People who had almost nothing gave $5, $10, sometimes only loose change. The crooked blue house on the notebook's cover had become their symbol. A place where no one was turned away. That little book saved my child, the woman whispered. Claire lowered her eyes. It was everyone, she said. Not me. But the stories continued. The restaurant owner had once been an undocumented dishwasher who was cheated out of months of wages. Claire had found a legal aid office and stayed beside him while he filed the complaint. The retired judge had been a young attorney battling alcoholism when Claire saw him crying alone in a hotel kitchen. She had not judged him. She had simply placed a cup of coffee beside him and said, "Go home before you lose the person you still are." Each name on the ledger was someone Claire had helped when she had been poor enough to need help herself. The envelopes were not debts. They were proof that kindness had survived. Ethan turned toward the brown coat. The hidden pocket, he said. Claire touched the repaired sleeve. My mother sewed it before she died. She told me to keep something valuable inside. The key? Claire shook her head. The names. Ethan looked down at the wedding ring on her hand, and shame rose through him like heat. He had built an elaborate lie because wealthy men had convinced him love must be measured by what someone refused to lose. Claire had measured it by what she was willing to give away. Why didn't you tell me? He asked. You never asked who I was before you rescued me." The words struck harder than anger. Ethan had always believed he had saved Claire from poverty. Standing in that cold corridor, surrounded by people whose lives she had changed, he understood the truth. She had never needed a rescuer. She had needed a husband who saw her. Claire closed the old notebook and held it against her chest. Then Daniel approached Ethan, his face pale. "There's something else," he said. Claire looked at him sharply. Daniel swallowed. "She knows the company never collapsed." The storage corridor became silent again. Ethan turned slowly toward Claire. "You knew?" Claire did not answer at once. She looked at Daniel, then at the attorney, then at the security men who had helped turn her husband's lie into a carefully staged disaster. Finally, she faced Ethan. "The bankruptcy papers used the old company seal," she said. "You replaced it last spring." Ethan's face drained of color. "And Daniel called from his personal phone," she continued. "During a real emergency, he would have used the encrypted line." Daniel lowered his eyes. Ethan could barely speak. "Then why did you do all this?" Claire looked around the corridor at the people who had come through the rain because she had asked them to protect 412 strangers. "Because the employees didn't know it was a test." Ethan frowned. Claire opened the small notebook and showed him a list she had written during the night. Names of warehouse workers, receptionists, junior analysts, cleaners, drivers, assistants, and parents whose children depended on their paychecks. "You wanted to know whether I would stay if you lost everything," she said. "I wanted to know what you would do if they did." The words landed with devastating clarity. Ethan had been so focused on testing one woman's loyalty that he had treated hundreds of lives like props in a private experiment. He looked at Daniel. "Cancel everything." Daniel nodded immediately. "The accounts were never frozen." "Not that," Ethan said. "Cancel the layoffs we discussed last month." "All of them." Claire's expression changed. Ethan stepped closer, but this time he did not reach for her. "I thought money made me powerful," he said. "Tonight, I watched you move people with nothing but trust." "No," Claire replied. "You watched kindness come home." By sunrise, the people in the storage facility had agreed to return every check and cancel every guarantee. The company had never needed the money. But Ethan refused to let the night become meaningless. He created an emergency employee fund in the names of the Beaumont Hotel workers who had once helped Claire. He gave every employee a written guarantee that no one would lose a job because of an executive's private mistake. He also transferred voting power over the foundation to Claire. Not as an apology disguised as a gift. As recognition. Months later, locker 317 was emptied. The cardboard boxes, letters, and old sewing machine were moved into a renovated building in Queens. Above the entrance hung a simple sign. The Blue House. It became a place where hotel workers, single parents, immigrants, and struggling families could receive legal help, temporary housing, job training, or sometimes only a warm meal and someone willing to listen. Walter Bennett funded the first year. The hospital director opened a free clinic twice a month. The restaurant owner sent food every Friday. And Ethan came without cameras. He carried boxes, cleaned floors, and learned the names of people he once would have passed without seeing. One evening, as Claire locked the front door, Ethan stood beside her wearing an old brown coat she had bought from a thrift store. "Do you still trust me?" he asked. Claire slipped the brass key onto the faded red string. "Trust isn't proved in one night," she said. "But it can begin again in one." Ethan nodded. Then they walked home together, not as a billionaire and the poor woman he believed he had rescued, but as two people finally seeing each other clearly. Because love is not revealed by what remains when money disappears. It is revealed by what we are willing to become for someone else. And sometimes, the person we try to test is the one holding the mirror. If this story touched you, share it with someone who still believes kindness is never wasted. And tell us in the comments, would you have forgiven Ethan? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that remind us what truly makes a person rich.